Hello, my name is Kate Nickel. I'm the pastor of the Eden United Methodist Church, and when we regularly meet and have communion, I like to make the communion bread from scratch. We've been making our bread from scratch since, I believe, at least 2008. So this is a recipe that we've used. It's a modified version of the King Arthur recipe. For it, you will need whole wheat flour. You will need all-purpose, we used unbleached all-purpose flour, canola oil. You can use multiple different kinds of sweetener, but I generally use honey. And then yeast, and for this particular one, we are doing dry milk and salt. That's it. That's all you need. So I'm going to start with 3.5 cups of flour. Take out my cup measure. So I like to have a little bit more whole wheat in my bread than for eating purposes than I would when I make the communion bread. Usually when I make the communion bread, I actually use more white flour. This is the white flour. I'm putting 1.5 cups of white flour. And 2 cups of whole wheat flour for a total of 3.5 cups of flour. Now I usually do this by putting all of the dry ingredients in and then putting in the wet. This is our yeast, and we'd use a standard measure of 2.5 teaspoons of yeast per loaf of bread. So that's 2.5 teaspoons. And then 1.25 teaspoons of salt. Now we've actually run out of iodized salt, which is really what you want to use. That's kosher salt. There's nothing wrong with it. It just tends to not spread as well. So that is 1.25 teaspoons of kosher salt, or iodized salt would be better. And then our final dry ingredient for this particular recipe is the dry milk. And that is 1/4 cup of dry milk. Now you might be able to hear the rolling kettle in the background, which means it's a little bit on the warm side. What we usually like to do. So I'm going to go turn that off and grab a mixer or a whisk. So what I like to do before putting in the hot water is to whisk together all of those dry ingredients. That's 3.5 cups of flour, 2.5 teaspoons of yeast, 1.25 teaspoons of salt, and 1/4 cup of dry milk. Now for our wet ingredients. This was a trick I learned a long time ago. If I want to use the same cup to measure both the oil and the honey, start with the oil first so that the honey flows right out of the cup after that. So that was 1/4 cup of oil. And now we're going to do 1/4 cup of honey. And this makes 1 standard loaf of bread. It's going to be a little bit sweeter that time because there was a little bit of an overflow. That's all right, it tastes good. Now I'm going to grab my hot water. Now, part of the reason it is important to actually mix all of those dry ingredients before putting the water in is that you want to make sure that the yeast is all spread through the flour mixture. And now that we have the other liquids, that as well, because if the water is too hot, it will actually kill the yeast in there. Now, usually a bread recipe says take the yeast and put it in lukewarm water and then add it in. This is one of those little shortcuts that we've managed to create over time because we've just made so much bread. Now the general standard of measurement that we use for the water is 1 1/3 cups. What I can tell you is it all depends on how humid it is in your environment. Bread is something that is very flexible when you're baking it. So I never put the whole amount of water in. Also, it's really hot, and I know that I probably made it too hot. So I'm just going to put some of it in and start to incorporate the ingredients together in the bowl. And then I have a mixer that I finished this off with. Now, when we first started making bread, our mixer actually didn't work. And so we did all of this by hand. So if you don't have a dough hook or a mixer, it's a lot more work. You can incorporate everything until it is sticky and ready for you to literally throw your dough on the counter. But we won't need to do that because we have the dough hook. So if you're mixing it, you're going to mix it until it's completely together so that you don't have, see how there's a lot of flour still in here? So that you don't have any flour left, and we'll see that in a moment. Now once you do that without the mixer, the mixer or the dough hook, what's going to happen is you then have to actually beat the flour onto a board of some sort, the dough onto a board of some sort for 10 minutes. Or until you learn what it means for the dough to actually be ready to rise. And that's a texture thing, it's also a learned thing. Now, as I mix this, one of the things I'm going to figure out is if I actually need some more water. And if I do, I'm actually going to use tap water versus more hot water because I know I've got plenty of hot water in there. Now, usually while this is baking, what I do is I get my bowl that I'm going to use for the bread to rise and ready. And I do that with spray, canola spray. You can do the spray with flour already put in it. That's also okay. Now, what I can tell you right now is my dough is actually a little bit on the wet side. Now, there's multiple ways to address that. If you have one of these, you stop it and you put more flour in. If you're working with it on the board, you put more flour in, but you incorporate it in while kneading it, like this. Now that rule of 10 minutes should also apply for your mixer as well. However, sometimes it can do a better job faster than the human hand can. And as a result, you don't need it to go for a whole 10 minutes. It's really all about what is the texture. So I'm going to stop this for a moment, and I'm going to touch the bread to see what it is. The dough, to see what the texture of the dough is. So it's a little bit sticky, a little bit moist. That's exactly what you want. It's mostly coming away from the bowl right now. So because I've made enough bread, I know that's about where I want it. So it looks like that's a good example of what the dough should look like when it's time to take it out of the bowl. So you notice how I took it off the dough hook. All right, so one of the things that if I think it's not quite right, and this is about right but not quite, is you take a little bit of flour. Now if you're kneading it on a board, this is something you needed to know before now. You put flour on your clean kitchen surface or a board. A board is actually the best way to do it. And then you take your dough. All right, so this is actually proper technique for kneading, like this. Fold, push down hard. Fold, push down hard. Now this bread has basically been kneaded already. And so you'll notice that it actually got firmer as I was doing that, which means it's now ready to go into the bowl that we've greased and rise for about 30 to 45 minutes. What you want it to do is double in size from wherever it is when you put it in the bowl. So now what I'm going to do is cover this and let it rise, and we'll come back when it's time to shape the loaf and put it in a pan and have it rise a second time. Thanks for joining us. Now our bread rose quite nicely today. You see, this is essentially doubling in size. So now what I'm going to do is make sure that I grease the loaf pan. We've recently been using the spray with canola and flour. We find it actually helps and ensures that nothing sticks. So I'm going to spray that. Now I left the little bit of flour that I used before to knead the dough. I'm going to actually take the bowl, upend it into that flour. You want to make sure that the surface is covered, because otherwise it'll stick. So I'm going to spread it out. You can see that the dough has tons of life in it. All right, so I'm going to fold one side in after I've spread it out, then the other, and then I'm going to knead a little bit as I go, and I'm just going to roll the dough into roughly the length of the pan, but not quite. Then you'll see it doesn't really have great ends, and then I push these in, pull the top down and over like that, pick it up, and I place it in my pan. Now this actually rose quite well in the first rise, but it is now time to let it rise some more. So we are going to wait for it to crest the top of the pan, and I will slit the loaf just before it is time to put it into the oven. So we're going to cover it again now. This time it'll rise usually for a longer period of time than the first one. Roughly 30 to 45 minutes, but you can check. Always check. So now, because I know that this is probably going to rise quickly, I'm going to turn my oven on and set it to 350 degrees. So now we wait. So once I pull this back, you'll be able to see that the bread has actually crested the pan. Now, one of the things I've learned with the oven that we currently have is that we will get a very nice oven rise out of this bread. So another thing we have learned is that if you split the top of the loaf, you are likely to cut down on the air bubbles that occur at the top of the crust. So I'm going to do that with a bread knife. And then this is going to go right in the oven for 35 minutes at 350 degrees.
I'm coming to just a minute.
And that's this step until it comes out of the oven. Our bread is ready to come out of the oven. I usually have a rack out to take it immediately out of the pan. It should just fall right out. Let's see what we have here. See how it continued to rise in the oven? It turned out quite nice. So I'm going to tip it over. Way to know if your bread is done is to tap the bottom. And if it sounds dense but hollow, it is done. So, there you have it. Our loaf of bread.